The date is the 4th of June, 1940. A man stands at a dispatch box in the House of Commons in London. He is tired, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and doesn't leave. His name is Winston Churchill, and the words he is about to speak will echo for generations. But before he speaks, before the world learns what happened on the beaches of northern France, before the myth is born, you need to understand one thing. What you are about to hear is not the story of a triumph. It is the story of the greatest military catastrophe in British history, of how an entire army, 350,000 men, ended up with their backs against the sea, with no way out, surrounded by the most powerful land force on Earth. It is the story of how they came within hours of total annihilation. And it is the story of a decision, one single, inexplicable decision made by the German High Command that may have changed the course of the entire war. But here is what you need to know right now. In the 9 days between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, over 300,000 men were pulled from the beaches and harbor of a small French port town called Dunkirk. The question is not whether they escaped. They did. The question is why, and what it nearly cost them. To understand Dunkirk, you have to go back to a map. And on that map, you have to understand that the battle was already lost before a single shot was fired at the beaches. It was May 1940. The so-called phony war, 8 months of almost no fighting on the Western Front, had just ended. On the 10th of May, Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the great offensive in the West. Now, Allied planners had expected this. They had prepared for it, in fact. The French and British had placed their best, most mobile forces in Belgium, ready to push north and east when Germany advanced, as they had in 1914, through the flat plains of Flanders. The plan was called the Dial Plan. It was logical, it was sensible, and it was exactly what the Germans were counting on. Because while the Allies surged north into Belgium, a German armored force of extraordinary size and speed drove through somewhere nobody expected, the Ardennes Forest, a densely wooded, hilly region on the Franco-Belgian border that Allied planners had declared, almost unanimously, impassable for tanks. They were wrong. General Erich von Manstein, one of the most gifted operational minds of the 20th century, had devised a plan of stunning audacity. It called for the main German armored thrust not through Belgium, but through the Ardennes. The plan was so aggressive, so reliant on speed, that even some German generals opposed it. The Army Chief of Staff called it a gamble. Hitler, unusually, loved it. It worked beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. By the 14th of May, 4 days into the offensive, German panzer divisions under Generals Guderian and Rommel had already crossed the Meuse River. They were in France, not Belgium, France, and they were moving west, not toward Paris, but toward the English Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium were about to be cut off. Here is the first thing you need to keep in the back of your mind as this story unfolds. Guderian's panzers were moving at a speed that defied understanding. 40, 50, 60 miles a day. The kind of advance that broke the internal logic of the armies trying to respond to it, because those armies were still thinking in terms of the last war, where a mile a day was progress. By the 20th of May, German armor had reached the Channel coast near Abbeville. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and a large portion of the French army were now in a pocket. They were surrounded on 3 sides. The 4th side was the sea. 350,000 men, trapped. The question now was not whether to fight, it was whether there was anything left to save. In London, the situation was understood with crystalline clarity by very few people, and one of them had been Prime Minister for less than 2 weeks. Winston Churchill had replaced Neville Chamberlain on the 10th of May, the same day Germany launched its offensive. He had inherited not just a government, but a catastrophe already in motion. What Churchill grasped, and what is critical to understanding everything that follows, is that the BEF was not just a military force. It was the foundation of Britain's capacity to continue the war at all. If those men were lost, If 350,000 trained soldiers, with their officers, their experience, their institutional knowledge, if they were killed or captured in France, Britain's ability to defend itself, let alone fight on, was finished. There were voices in Churchill's own war cabinet urging negotiation. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was among them. In late May 1940, with the BEF surrounded and apparently doomed, Halifax argued that Britain should approach Mussolini, who had not yet entered the war, as an intermediary to explore peace terms with Hitler. Churchill refused. But his refusal was not yet the iron certainty of legend. It was a political calculation made in real time, under conditions of genuine uncertainty, by a man who did not yet know whether there was anything left to fight with. The answer to that question would depend entirely on what happened at a small port city on the French coast. Its name was Dunkirk. Dunkirk. Dunkirk was not chosen because it was ideal. It was chosen because there was nothing else. By the third week of May, as German armor completed its encirclement, the options for evacuation narrowed to a handful of channel ports: Calais, Boulogne, and Dunkirk. Boulogne fell on the 25th of May. Calais, in one of the war's least remembered acts of sacrifice, held until the 26th, buying precious time, the garrison ordered to fight to the last by Churchill himself, in a decision he described as one of the most painful he ever made. That left Dunkirk. And Dunkirk had a problem. Several problems, actually. The harbor was large but dominated by a long stone mole, a jetty, that extended into the sea. It was not designed for loading tens of thousands of men onto ships under fire. The beaches stretching east from the town were wide and flat, which sounded promising until you understood that the water was also shallow, meaning large ships could not get close enough to embark men directly. The arithmetic was grim. If the Royal Navy used only its destroyers and large vessels, loading men from the mole, it might, in ideal conditions, lift around 45,000 men. The BEF numbered over 300,000. There was also another problem, a far more pressing one: the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, had made a personal promise to Adolf Hitler. His aircraft would finish what the panzers had started. He would destroy the Allied forces on the beaches from the air before they could escape. No evacuation, no rescue, just annihilation from above. And on the 26th of May 1940, the day the British government authorized the evacuation under the operational code name Dynamo, Göring's bombers were already in the air. Now, before we go any further, there is a question hanging over this story that we haven't answered yet. If the German armored forces had already cut off the BEF by the 20th of May, why did they not simply drive forward and destroy it? Why did the panzers stop short of Dunkirk itself? The answer to that question is one of the most debated decisions of the entire war, and it is the key to everything. We will come back to it. The 24th of May 1940. German panzer divisions under Guderian were, by some accounts, within artillery range of Dunkirk. Their forward elements had reached the canal line southwest of the town. They could see the channel. They could, theoretically, have driven through the remnants of the Allied rearguard and reached the beaches before any significant evacuation had begun. Then came the order: halt. From the German High Command, likely with Hitler's direct involvement and the concurrence of Army Group A Commander von Rundstedt, the panzers were ordered to stop, to hold their positions, to allow the Luftwaffe to finish the job. The halt order lasted for 2 days, the 24th and 25th of May. 2 days during which the encirclement tightened, but the decisive blow did not fall. 2 days during which the British began to organize, to plan, to bring ships forward. Why did it happen? Historians have argued over this question for 80 years and have not reached a consensus. Some argue the practical case. The panzer forces had driven 600 miles in 2 weeks, their vehicles needed maintenance, their supply lines were extended, and Dunkirk's canal-laced, low-lying terrain was genuinely unsuitable for armor. The infantry, it was reasoned, should clear the pocket. Some argue the strategic case. Hitler, at this point, still hoped for a negotiated peace with Britain. Destroying the BEF entirely, humiliating Britain beyond recovery, might close that door. By allowing the men to escape, he left the door open. Some argue the bureaucratic case. Göring lobbied aggressively for his Luftwaffe to have the kill. It was a prestige play. Hitler granted it. None of these explanations is entirely satisfying. All of them may be partly true. What is certain is this. When the halt order was finally lifted on the 26th of May, the same day Operation Dynamo was formally authorized, the window had cracked open just enough. What happened next was unprecedented. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay ran Operation Dynamo from a room carved into the chalk cliffs beneath Dover Castle. The room had been a dynamo room in a previous life, which is how the operation got its name. It was cramped, it was electric with tension, and from it Ramsay coordinated one of the most complex naval operations ever attempted. The plan was straightforward in conception and nightmarish in execution. Ships, whatever ships could be found, would cross the channel, embark men from Dunkirk's harbor mole and from the beaches, and return to England. Then go back. And back again. 3 routes were charted across the channel. Route Z, the shortest at 39 miles, was quickly abandoned when it proved to be within range of German coastal batteries. Route X was used when minesweeping allowed. Route Y, the longest at 87 miles, was used most frequently. Those extra miles mattered. They meant longer exposure to air attack. They meant more time at sea. They meant more ships sunk. Now here is where the story of Dunkirk becomes something genuinely extraordinary. Because the Royal Navy, as the evacuation began, did not have enough ships, not even close. On the evening of the 26th of May, Ramsay's staff issued an urgent appeal, not just to the Navy, but to anyone who could sail. The Ministry of Shipping commandeered civilian vessels. The appeal went out to pleasure boat owners, ferry operators, lifeboat crews, river pilots. What came back, across the Channel, across the North Sea, from harbors and marinas and fishing ports along the English coast, was the small ships. Paddle steamers, yachts, motor cruisers, Thames river launches, fishing smacks, a channel ferry that had been running passengers to the Isle of Man, a fire float from the London Fire Brigade. In total, over 800 civilian and auxiliary vessels joined the evacuation alongside the Royal Navy's warships. Some were crewed by their peacetime owners, men and women in their 50s and 60s who had never been to war, who had simply heard the appeal on the radio and sailed. The story of those small ships has perhaps been gilded somewhat over the years. The image of the amateur sailor crossing a war zone to rescue soldiers is enormously compelling, and later mythology attached more heroism to them than the operational record strictly supports. Most of the men were taken off by the naval vessels. The small ships served primarily as ferries, moving men from the beaches out to the larger ships lying further offshore. But the small ships solved the shallowest water problem. They got to where the destroyers couldn't. And without them, the numbers would have been dramatically lower. To understand how those numbers were actually achieved, you have to understand the mechanics of what was happening on those beaches, and how fundamentally impossible the logistical problem appeared to everyone who encountered it. Start with the geography. The beaches east of Dunkirk, La Panne, Bray Dunes, Malo-les-Bains, stretched for roughly 10 miles along the Flemish coast. They were wide, flat, featureless strips of sand backed by low dunes. Under different circumstances, they would have been pleasant enough. In the last days of May 1940, they were a killing ground in the making, crammed with the remnants of an entire army. At low tide, the water retreated so far from the shore that men wading into the sea could walk for 300 or 400 yards and still only be knee-deep. A standard Royal Navy destroyer drew 14 feet of water. The ships simply could not come in close enough to embark men directly. And there were no piers, no docking facilities, nothing. Just sand and sea and men. The first improvised solution was the human queue. Soldiers, often under the direction of NCOs and junior officers who showed extraordinary composure in circumstances that invited panic, organized themselves into long columns that extended from the dunes down to the water's edge and then kept going, into the sea. Men stood chest-deep in the English Channel, sometimes for hours, waiting for a small boat to come alongside. Some of them had been standing in cold water since before dawn. Some of them were wounded. Some of them were still standing in their full kit, rifles in hand, because the order to ditch equipment had not yet been given, or because the soldier had simply not been able to bring himself to abandon the weapon he had carried since training. It was an improvised solution to an impossible problem, and it barely worked. Then someone, the name is not definitively recorded, had a different idea. The lorries. The BEF had abandoned thousands of military vehicles on the roads of northern France and Belgium. There were lorries, trucks, and transport vehicles of every description clogging the approaches to Dunkirk. Some soldiers, thinking laterally in a situation that demanded it, began driving these vehicles onto the beaches and into the surf, nose first, as far as the water would allow, until the vehicles were axle deep, then door deep, and finally up to their roofs in the channel swell. The lorries were then lashed together, side by side, to form makeshift jetties extending out from the beach. A man could walk from dry sand out along the roofs and bonnets of a line of half-submerged trucks and climb directly into a small boat waiting at the end. It was ungainly, dangerous, and prone to collapse as the tide shifted and the vehicles moved. But it worked, after a fashion, and it was the kind of practical improvisation under pressure that recurs throughout the Dunkirk story. The more permanent and ultimately more important solution was the East Mole. The mole at Dunkirk, the long stone breakwater that extended roughly a mile into the harbor, had been designed as a seawall, not a passenger embarkation point. It was never intended to have ships come alongside it for loading. It was narrow, exposed, and battered by the swell. But it was solid, it was long, and it extended into water deep enough for destroyers. The decision to use it as a boarding point was made almost on impulse in the early hours of the operation by the senior naval officer at Dunkirk, Captain William Tennant. Tennant had arrived on the 27th of May and quickly understood that embarkation directly from the beaches was too slow. He signaled Ramsay at Dover and recommended bringing the ships to the mole. It was, by every conventional naval standard, a reckless suggestion. The mole was exposed to air attack. The approach channel was narrow and difficult. Ships mooring alongside it would be sitting targets. Ramsay authorized it anyway. There was no better option. Once the mole was in use, the tempo of the operation changed dramatically. The destroyers and larger vessels, which had been standing offshore waiting for small boats to ferry men out, could now come directly to the mole wall. Men filed along the narrow walkway in single file, sometimes 4 and 5 abreast when the crowds became unmanageable, stepping directly from the stone onto the decks of warships below. In good conditions, a destroyer could load several hundred men in under an hour, but conditions were rarely good. The tide rose and fell, lifting and dropping the ships against the mole wall with unpredictable violence. Gangplanks shifted and splintered. In the darkness, the evacuations were conducted as much as possible at night to reduce vulnerability to air attack. Men missed their footing and fell into the black water between the ship's hull and the stone wall. The noise was extraordinary. The constant boom of bombs and artillery, the crack of small arms fire from the perimeter, the shriek of dive bombers, and under all of it, the steady sound of thousands of men moving in disciplined silence, because they had been told to be quiet, and the discipline of the British Army held even here. Now let us talk about the ships themselves, because not all ships were equal at Dunkirk, and the mix of vessels involved tells you something important about how the operation actually worked. The backbone of the evacuation was the Royal Navy's destroyer fleet. Destroyers were the ideal vessel for the task in almost every respect: fast enough to minimize time under air attack, maneuverable enough to work the difficult approaches, and capacious enough to carry several hundred men at a time. At the start of the operation, Ramsay had approximately 40 destroyers available in the Southern Command. By the second day, many of those had been pulled back after suffering damage or losses, and Churchill was forced to intervene directly to demand that the Admiralty release additional vessels from other commands. A fully loaded destroyer at Dunkirk carried far more men than it was designed to accommodate. The ships had been built for crews of around 200. During the evacuation, they regularly embarked between 600 and 900 soldiers, packed into every available space below decks, crowded into gun emplacements, sitting on torpedo tubes, lying across each other on the floors of engine rooms. The ships rode low and heavy in the water, sluggish to respond, and dangerously vulnerable if hit. HMS Harvester returned to Dover on one crossing with over 1,000 men aboard. HMS Vanquisher carried 900. These were not exceptional cases. They were the norm. Then there were the cross-channel ferries, the passenger steamers that, in peacetime, had carried holidaymakers and commercial travelers between England and France on scheduled routes. In the first days of the war, many of these had already been converted to hospital ships or troop transports. At Dunkirk, they were put to use in their most familiar role, loading passengers. Except the passengers were exhausted soldiers who had been on the beaches for days, and the ferries were being bombed. The ferry SS Canterbury crossed the Channel 14 times during the operation. The Isle of Man steam packet vessel SS Mona's Isle was one of the first vessels to attempt embarkation directly from the beaches, and was badly damaged by shellfire on her first run, limping home with 1,420 men aboard and 23 of them dead, killed on the deck by German artillery. The hospital ships were a category of their own, conspicuously marked with red crosses, illuminated at night, sailing under the laws of war that were supposed to grant them protection from attack. For the first days of the operation, this protection held. Then, the Luftwaffe bombed them anyway. The hospital ship HMHS Brighton was attacked and badly damaged. Others were near missed. The pretense of protected status dissolved in the reality of what the evacuation had become. And then there were the small ships, the ones that have since become the symbol of the whole operation. The call had gone out on the 14th of May, 10 days before the evacuation formally began, when the Admiralty asked all owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length to register their vessels. They had not told the owners why. By the time Operation Dynamo was authorized, the Ministry of Shipping had a list of hundreds of vessels that could be requisitioned immediately. What arrived at Dunkirk over the following days was an astonishing cross-section of British civilian maritime life. The motor yacht Sundowner, skippered by Commander Charles Lightoller, who had survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 and was now 66 years old, made the crossing with his son and a Sea Scout as crew, and brought back 130 men, packing them into every inch of the vessel until she was barely afloat. Lightoller, characteristically, refused to let the men come on deck because he was worried about capsizing. There was the Tamzine, a small open fishing boat, 18 feet long, the smallest vessel officially credited with participating in the evacuation. There were Thames pleasure cruisers that normally carried day trippers past Greenwich and Tower Bridge. There were Dutch squits, shallow-bottomed cargo boats that had fled the Netherlands after the German invasion and now found themselves pressed into service ferrying soldiers through the surf. These small vessels did their most important work not in carrying men directly to England, few of them were capable of the open sea crossing safely with a full load, but in the inshore shuttle. A destroyer could not get within 400 yards of the beach without grounding. A motor launch could get within 20. A ship's lifeboat or a small skiff could go all the way to the waterline. So the small boats went in, took off 10 or 20 men at a time, ferried them out to the waiting destroyers, and went back. Over and over, in choppy water, under fire, through oil slicks from burning ships, around floating bodies and drifting wreckage. The men running these boats were not all heroes in the conventional sense. Some were terrified. Some turned back. There are recorded cases of civilian boat operators who made one crossing and refused to return. But the majority kept going, and the cumulative effect of hundreds of small vessels making hundreds of small shuttles added up, over 9 days, to tens of thousands of men saved. The organization required to keep this operation running, or, more accurately, the degree to which it ran despite almost no organization, is one of the genuinely remarkable features of Dunkirk. Ramsay's staff at Dover was working around the clock with inadequate communications. The telephone lines to France were unreliable. Radio contact with ships at sea was intermittent. The situation at the beaches changed faster than reports could travel back to Dover, meaning that the decisions being made in the chalk-walled operations room were often based on information that was hours out of date. Captain Tennant at Dunkirk was effectively running the embarkation on the ground with the authority to make immediate tactical decisions. He controlled the allocation of berthing at the mole, directed ships to the beaches or the harbor as conditions allowed, and managed the extraordinarily difficult problem of traffic. Because there were, at peak periods, dozens of ships simultaneously trying to approach, load, and depart from a harbor that had been partly destroyed by bombing, and whose approach channel was dotted with wrecks. The wrecks were a constant problem. Ships hit by bombs or torpedoes in the approaches did not simply sink cleanly. They capsized or broke apart, or settled at angles that left their superstructures above the waterline, creating obstacles in channels that were already narrow. Minesweepers and small craft worked continuously to mark these hazards and find navigable routes through them. Captains coming into Dunkirk in darkness, under fire, with no effective navigation lights, were threading their way through a graveyard of their own fleet. Fuel and provisions for the returning men were pre-positioned at Dover and at subsidiary ports along the English coast. The organization of reception, feeding, clothing, and transporting several thousand men arriving in an exhausted and often traumatized state every few hours, fell largely to local volunteers, the Women's Voluntary Service, railway workers, and the simple human impulse of English civilians who gathered at the quaysides with sandwiches and cups of tea. It was amateur logistics at industrial scale, and it worked. The railway alone shifted over 300,000 men away from the Kent coast in the course of the operation. Special troop trains ran continuously from Dover, Ramsgate, Folkestone, and smaller ports to distribution points further north, clearing the quaysides to make room for the next wave of arrivals. The Southern Railway operated its network under conditions of enormous strain. Rolling stock was being pulled from mainline routes, timetables had ceased to exist, and station staff were dealing with thousands of armed, disoriented, and sometimes wounded men arriving without notice. It is easy, standing back from the operational detail, to see Dunkirk as a story of improvisation and heroism. Both of those things were present. But there was also something else. An extraordinary, grinding logistical competence, exercised by ordinary people, sailors, railway workers, harbor masters, police, nurses, who had never anticipated doing any of this, and did it anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. The scale of the operation can sometimes obscure the individual experience of it. So consider, for a moment, what it was actually like to be one of the men waiting on those beaches. You have been marching and fighting, in some cases, for 2 weeks. Your unit has been broken up, your officers are dead or missing, and the army to which you belong has essentially ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. You have been told to make for the coast. You have marched through burning villages, past columns of refugees, past the abandoned equipment of 100 different units, rifles in ditches, artillery pieces tipped into canals, the detritus of a routed army spread across 50 miles of French countryside. You arrive at the beach at Bray Dunes or La Panne, and you see, for the first time, the scale of what has happened. The beach is black with men. Tens of thousands of men, stretching as far as you can see in both directions, many of them simply sitting in the sand, waiting. There is sporadic shelling. Aircraft come over periodically and the crowds scatter into the dunes, then reform when the bombs have fallen. The sea is calm and gray, and there are ships on the horizon, but no boats are coming in right now, and no one can tell you when they will come. You join a queue. The queue extends down to the water. You do not know how long you will wait. You do not know if a ship will come before the Germans break through the perimeter and reach the beach. The noise from the south, artillery, explosions, has been continuous since before dawn, and it seems, if anything, to be getting closer. You wait. You have no food left. You drank the last of your water yesterday. The man next to you is from a different regiment, and you have never met him before, and you talk about nothing very much. Football, whether it will rain, what you are going to eat when you get back to England. Because there is nothing else to say, and because saying these things is a way of maintaining the belief that you will, in fact, get back to England. Then the boats come. Sometimes it was a destroyer, coming in as close as it dared, putting out its own ship's lifeboats to ferry men from the shallows. Sometimes it was one of the small civilian vessels, driven by a man in a peacetime captain's cap who had left his marina in Ramsgate or Poole the previous evening and arrived here, impossibly, on this beach in occupied France, and was now holding his boat steady in the swell and telling the soldiers to climb in, 3 at a time. Careful now, don't rush, 3 at a time. The soldiers loaded the boats in good order, mostly. The discipline held, which was itself remarkable, because the temptation to rush, to fight for a place, to abandon the queue and wade out to the nearest boat regardless of who was ahead of you, must have been enormous. That the queues held, that the loading was orderly, that relatively few boats were capsized by desperate men throwing themselves aboard, these things speak to something real about the soldiers on those beaches. Or perhaps they speak to the NCOs standing in the water up to their necks, directing traffic, holding the line, telling the men to wait their turn. We should be honest, though, about the limits of that order. Because the popular image of Dunkirk is often rather clean, orderly queues of soldiers, calm men standing chest-deep in water, a kind of stoic British dignity. The reality was considerably darker. In the first days of the evacuation, before discipline had been fully enforced, there were scenes of chaos, desperate men rushing boats, capsizing them, fighting for places on the handful of vessels that appeared. French soldiers, initially excluded from the evacuation, stood on the beaches and watched British troops embark. The tension between Allied forces was acute and sometimes violent. German aircraft came in waves. The Junkers 87 Stukas, with their distinctive screaming dive sirens, were devastating to morale even when their accuracy was not precise. Bombs fell among queuing men. The beaches, already churned by shelling, were periodically transformed into killing grounds. Men spent days on those beaches. Some waited 5, 6 days before they were taken off, sleeping in the dunes, eating whatever rations remained, watching the oil-black smoke from burning fuel tanks rise thousands of feet into the air and serve grimly as a navigation beacon for the ships. The harbor and the mole were, if anything, worse. Dunkirk town was burning. The harbor facilities had been bombed repeatedly. The mole itself, a narrow stone walkway never designed for mass embarkation, had to be walked single file, in darkness, under fire, to reach the ships. Men fell into the water. Ships were bombed at the quayside with men still aboard. The destroyer HMS Wakeful was sunk by a torpedo on the 29th of May, with around 700 men aboard. Most of them lost because the life jackets of exhausted, equipment-laden soldiers pulled their unconscious heads underwater. The rescue ship HMS Grafton, arriving to help survivors, was then also torpedoed. In 6 days of operations, 6 British destroyers were sunk outright. 19 more were damaged badly enough to be put out of action, and yet they kept coming. Back and forth, Ramsay's armada crossed and recrossed the channel. Here is something that has never entirely faded from British memory. The men on the beaches, watching the Stukas dive, watching the bombers come in low and unmolested, they looked up and they did not see the RAF. The soldiers who came home from Dunkirk were, in many cases,
furious. They had been bombed for days, they had been strafed, they had watched ships go down. And where were the fighter boys? The anger lasted years. When RAF aircrew walked into pubs in England after Dunkirk, they were sometimes told, in no uncertain terms, that they had been conspicuously absent when they were needed. This is one of the great misunderstandings of Dunkirk. The RAF was there.
It was fighting, desperately, at the edge of its operational range. The Spitfires and Hurricanes based in southern England could maintain patrols over Dunkirk for only short periods before fuel forced them home. The fighting often took place at altitude, far above the beaches, where the men below could not see it. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's 11 Group flew over 2,700 sorties during the Dunkirk operation. In the air battles over and around the beaches, the RAF lost 145 aircraft, and the Luftwaffe lost 156. But here is the thing Park's pilots understood with a cold clarity that the exhausted men on the beaches did not. He could not send everything he had over Dunkirk, because in a few weeks, those same Spitfires and Hurricanes were going to be needed to defend England itself. He was already thinking about the Battle of Britain. He was already rationing the war. This is not a detail that made the soldiers less angry, but it is the detail that explains why Britain survived what came next. And it also explains why Goering's promise, his boast that the Luftwaffe alone would finish the BEF, fell short. The beaches were pounded, ships were sunk, men died in numbers that are difficult to comprehend, but the Luftwaffe could not, stop the evacuation. Partly because of the RAF, partly because of the weather, heavy cloud and rain grounded German aircraft on several crucial days. The overcast that soldiers sheltering in the dunes cursed as misery was also, in a very real sense, saving their lives. And partly because of something the German High Command had not fully accounted for: the stubbornness of the rearguard. While the evacuation was underway, someone had to hold the line. The Dunkirk perimeter, a rough semicircle of canal lines and town defenses, held by British and French troops, was the reason the evacuation was possible at all. If the perimeter collapsed, the Germans would be on the beaches. The ships would not be able to approach. The operation would be over. Holding that perimeter cost a great deal. British rearguard divisions, particularly the 50th and the 3rd Infantry, fought continuous defensive actions through the last days of May and the first days of June. When they were not fighting, they were marching, retreating in good order to the next canal line, the next village, the next defensible position. And then there was the French army. The story of Dunkirk in British memory has sometimes glossed over the French contribution, but it should not. French forces of Army Group 1, fighting alongside the British, bore a disproportionate share of the rearguard fighting, particularly in the final days when most of the British had already been evacuated. It was French soldiers who held Lille, in a siege lasting 3 days, against 7 German divisions, allowing the coastal corridor to remain open. When the Lille garrison finally surrendered on the 31st of May, the German general conducting the surrender ordered his troops to present arms to their opponents. It was a gesture of respect that recognized something the later popular memory sometimes forgot. At Dunkirk, the French fought and died so others could escape. The French contribution to the actual evacuation was also, in the end, substantial. After initially limiting evacuation priority to the BEF, the British government agreed, under considerable French political pressure, to include French troops in the lifts. In the final days of the operation, French soldiers made up the majority of those being embarked. Of the 338,226 men rescued at Dunkirk, approximately 110,000 were French. The operation ran from the 26th of May to the 4th of June, 1940. 9 days. The original estimate, made by the War Office before the evacuation began, was that 45,000 men might be saved. The rest, 250,000 men, were written off. What was actually achieved exceeded every projection. Day 1, approximately 7,700 men. By day 3, as the small ships arrived and the mole embarkation was refined, the daily totals climbed dramatically. The 30th of May saw nearly 54,000 men lifted. The 31st,
another 68,000. By that point, with the perimeter contracting and the pressure increasing, every hour counted. The final ships left in the early hours of the 4th of June. When the count was made, 338,226 men had been evacuated. The equipment left behind was staggering. 63,000 vehicles, 12,000 artillery pieces, 500,000 tons of ammunition, rations, and stores. The BEF had essentially left France with nothing but the men and what they carried. They had come home, but they had come home empty-handed. Britain now had an army, and almost nothing to arm it with. If Germany had invaded in the summer of 1940, which was precisely what Hitler was contemplating, it would have found a country that could put 2 or 3 partially equipped divisions in the field south of London. That is not an army. That is an obstacle.
The 338,000 men at Dunkirk did not save Britain by being rescued. They saved Britain by existing, by being the seed from which a new army would grow, by carrying the institutional knowledge, the NCOs, the junior officers, the company commanders, who would train and lead the divisions that would one day fight in North Africa, in Italy, on the beaches of Normandy. Without Dunkirk, there is no El Alamein. Without El Alamein, there may be no D-Day. But none of that was obvious on the morning of the 4th of June. What was obvious on that morning was this: Britain had an enormous army in France, and now it was gone. On the 4th of June, 1940, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons. He did not pretend. He made it clear from the outset that what had happened was a defeat. "Wars are not won by evacuations," he said. The tone was somber, honest, unflinching. And then, building through paragraph after paragraph, the speech arrived at its famous close. He spoke of fighting on the beaches, of fighting on the landing grounds, of fighting in the fields and in the streets, of never surrendering. The speech was not primarily about Dunkirk. It was about what came next. It was a message to Britain, and, critically, to the United States, that this country was not done. That the loss of France, the loss of the BEF's equipment, the loss of every strategic advantage Britain had held 6 months earlier, none of it meant Britain would negotiate. The speech was also, in a sense, a creation. It transformed a military catastrophe into a national narrative, a story about resilience, about something characteristically British in the face of impossible odds, about the capacity to absorb disaster and keep going. There is a word that attached itself to Dunkirk in those weeks and has never quite left: miracle. It is worth examining that word carefully, because what happened at Dunkirk was not miraculous. It was the product of extraordinary planning under impossible conditions, of sailors who crossed a war zone 40 and 50 times, of soldiers who held a collapsing perimeter with discipline and courage, of an air force that fought above the clouds where no one could see them, of weather that intervened at the right moments, and of a German decision to stop that no historian has ever satisfactorily explained. It was not a miracle. It was something more interesting than a miracle. It was a series of improbabilities, each one individually explicable, that combined to produce an outcome that should not have been possible. And in that outcome lay the seed of everything that followed. But we should not leave the story on the note of triumph, because Dunkirk had costs that are not always counted in the popular memory. Of the men who did not make it to the beaches, or who made it to the beaches and were not taken off, tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured in the fighting retreat. Approximately 40,000 British and French troops were left behind when the last ships sailed. Many of these were French soldiers holding the final perimeter, men who had been told they would be taken off and were not because the ships ran out or the harbor closed or the orders changed. For those men, the war became something very different. German captivity, prisoner of war camps, 5 years of waiting for a war that was being fought elsewhere. And there were atrocities. On the 27th of May, 1940, at a farmhouse near the village of Wormhout, less than 20 miles from the beaches of Dunkirk, soldiers of the SS Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler herded approximately 90 British and French prisoners into a barn and murdered them. Grenades were thrown into the crowded space. Those who survived the blasts were shot. The Wormhout massacre was one of several such killings during the Dunkirk campaign. They happened largely beyond the view of the world, in the confusion of a fast-moving battle, and did not become widely known until long after the war. There was also the loss of the Lancastria. On the 17th of June, 1940, 2 weeks after Dunkirk ended, the Cunard liner HMT Lancastria was bombed and sunk off the coast of Saint-Nazaire while embarking troops in a separate, chaotic evacuation. Between 3,000 and 5,000 people died, the largest single loss of life in any incident involving a British ship in the entire war. Churchill suppressed the news. He did not want the British public, still processing the shock of the fall of France, absorbing another catastrophe. The Lancastria disaster remained largely hidden for years. It remains, even now, one of the least discussed events of 1940. Dunkirk, in other words, was not the end of the disaster. It was the salvation within the disaster. What it saved was remarkable. What it could not save was also extraordinary, and the gap between the two is where the real history lives. The mythology of Dunkirk has grown considerably in the decades since 1940. It has been used, honestly and dishonestly, clearly and clumsily, as a shorthand for a particular idea of British national character. The idea that in the moment of greatest crisis, the country comes together, that civilians sail to war, that the amateur, the improvised, the unexpected rises to the occasion. There is truth in this. The small ships were real, the improvisation was real, the courage was real. But the mythology has also, at times, been used to paper over failure. The evacuation was necessary because of a military collapse of staggering scale, an Allied command that had fundamentally misread German intentions, a political leadership that had spent the 1930s hoping that firmness would be unnecessary, a British army that was equipped and structured for a war that bore almost no resemblance to the war it was actually fighting. Dunkirk did not redeem those failures. It survived them. And there's one final thing to say about the operation, something that is rarely said, but which changes the shape of the story. The men who were saved at Dunkirk did not feel, in large measure, that they had been part of a miracle. They felt that they had been beaten. The veterans who came home in June 1940 were not triumphant. They were exhausted, humiliated, often angry. They had left France without fighting the kind of battle they believed they could have won. They had abandoned their vehicles, their equipment, their positions. Sometimes, in the chaos, their dead. The Dunkirk spirit, the phrase that has been used ever since, was, in its original form, not a feeling of national pride. It was a determination not to be beaten again. It was the refusal to accept that what had happened would define the outcome of the war. And that determination, that refusal, is what Churchill understood and shaped when he stood up on the 4th of June. He did not tell them it was a victory. He told them they were going to win. There is a difference between those things, and it matters. So we come back to where we began, the man at the dispatch box, the speech. Operation Dynamo saved 338,226 men. It cost Britain 6 destroyers sunk, 19 more damaged, and over 200 other vessels of all sizes. It cost the RAF 145 aircraft. It cost the men on the perimeter, British and French, who held the line until there was no line left to hold, and who went into captivity or did not come back at all. It cost Calais, a garrison ordered to its death to buy the time that made the evacuation possible. And it produced something strange and durable. It produced a country that believed, in the face of all evidence, that it had a future. Not because of the speeches, not because of the myth, but because the men who came back from those beaches, the men who had stood in water to their chests waiting for a boat that might not come, who had watched the Stukas come down, who had slept in the dunes under the black smoke of a burning city, those men came back knowing something that cannot be taught. They knew what they had survived, and they knew they would survive again. The question that had haunted those 9 days, can an army be saved from the edge of annihilation, had been answered. Just barely, improbably, against the odds and against the logic of the situation. The answer was yes, And that answer, fragile and costly as it was, became the foundation on which everything that followed was built. D-Day was possible because of Dunkirk. The liberation of Europe was possible because of Dunkirk. The end of the war, on terms that were not a Nazi peace, was possible because of Dunkirk. Winston Churchill was right about one thing, even if he was right in the wrong direction. Wars are not won by evacuations, but they can begin with them.